My grandma disowned us the day I was born. 16 years later, she returned, broke, begging for shelter. Dad's reply left her speechless. While my mother was physically in labor with me, my grandma on my father's side declared, "I'm cutting you both out of my life. My other son's wife is wealthy and can fund my retirement. Your wife is a slow food stamp collector with horrible hair." Dad's jaws dropped, and his jaw clenched in rage. "Get the hell out if you're going to be racist to my wife." My grandma backed off, clearly outraged. "It's not racist. It's the truth. Your brother's wife is the best thing that's happened to us." She stared at my father as if he were a foolish child when he claimed that finding true love was the best thing that had occurred. "Good luck with your real love, don't come crawling back when she's framed you for a theft you didn't commit." She exited the delivery room, immediately buying airplane tickets with her other daughter-in-law's credit cards. I wasn't there to witness it, but my grandmother's actions sparked a fire within my parents. Mom pushed herself into teaching when I was a little older, and Dad worked extra shifts at the warehouse. When I was 7, Mom and Dad had saved enough money to start an after-school program. Mom tutored, while Dad taught life skills, such as car repair and DIY insulation for walls. Soon, 45 children had shown up. Meanwhile, my grandmother was living with my uncle and his wife Clara, traveling on vacation, spending her money, and purchasing new cars simply because she could. However, neither family was aware of this. Clara had been in the delivery room when I was born. She'd stood silently in the doorway, and hearing her mother-in-law refer to a newborn baby as a disgrace moved something inside her. That's when she learned about my father's achievements. By this point, the program had a second location. My parents were making enough money to relocate to a house with a pool and take vacations where I would have my own hotel room. That was when Clara made her move. "Market's been rough lately. We're losing a lot," she casually said during a smaller than usual family dinner. Grandma's eyes quickly widened. Clara quickly depleted the funds on my grandmother's card, causing it to decrease. Then grandmother's king-size bed was replaced with a single. Then came the big announcement. Clara arrived to lunch crying. "The lawyers say my trust fund could be frozen for years. We'll lose everything," my grandmother exclaimed. "Are you seriously telling me you're going broke?" Clara said, nodding as if it were true. Over the next 3 weeks, grandmother's expensive garments were auctioned to offset stock losses. Her $30 coffee was replaced with instant, and Clara and Richie even moved into an apartment to make the financial loss appear more realistic. That's when my granny snapped. "I think I need some space from you two while you figure things out financially. It's just so stressful for me." And with that, she stopped coming to dinners. She began avoiding Clara's calls, all for money that was never actually lost. That was when she realized she had another son. I was 16 years old when she came up at our door. Dad was at work, while Mom was at home. I'll never forget my grandmother's expression when she saw our house. The mental math was visible. The pool, the 2 vehicles, and my MacBook on the counter. "I've been thinking about family lately," she explained, clutching her counterfeit designer purse. "I realize I may have been hasty in the past." Mom, who is better than anyone deserves, asked her in for coffee. My grandmother sat in our kitchen, looking at our vacation photos, the accolades from the after-school program, and the life we'd established without her. "I always knew you two would make something of yourselves," she'd said. "I just wanted to give you space to grow." She burst into tears about being abandoned by both sons, feeling lonely, and how families should stick together. Then came the request. "I just need a little help getting back on my feet. Maybe I could stay in your guest room, just temporarily." Dad arrived home during the concert. He listened. Then he spoke calmly. "You called my baby a disgrace in the delivery room while my wife was still bleeding." I was upset. "I didn't mean—" "You meant every word," he shouted. "And you know how Clara is supposedly going broke?" Grandmother's ears perked up. "How do you know that?" she inquired. My father just smirked. "How do you know that?" "Brothers talk, Mom," he finally responded. He moved around, clearly relishing her panic. "You are aware that Clara's trust fund was never frozen." Grandmother's jaw dropped. "What do you mean?" she inquired, afraid to hear the answer. "Clara is a smart woman, Mom. She knows you only loved her money, so she put you to the test." My granny turned white. "That's impossible," she said, but she didn't believe herself. "Clara can buy you a Bentley at the snap of a finger. But now she never will, and you'll never see a cent off me either. Now get out of my house. Grandma has become desperate." Please, I'm your mother. You can't just. You're right. I can't just abandon family. Dad stood up. But I can give you exactly what you gave us, which is nothing. He shooed her out. And now comes the finest part. When my grandmother called my uncle from our driveway, sobbing because we had rejected her, he interrupted her. You know, Mom, my marriage has been better since you left. Clara and I aren't fighting, and we enjoy cheap TV dinners without you nagging us over $120 wine bottles. You're not welcome back. Her jaw fell. She returned inside, begging. Please, I'll go homeless if you don't take me in. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, knowing what she was saying was true. Their gazes locked for what seemed like an eternity, as grandmother stood between them, shivering. Mom's face had that teacher expression she gets when a child in the program needs assistance, but has also done something wrong. Dad's jaw remained stiff, but his eyes softened somewhat as he gazed at Mom. Finally, Mom spoke quietly but firmly, insisting that they discuss things alone first. Grandmother's sobbing grew louder, and she clutched Dad's arm, asking them not to abandon her on the street like a homeless person. Dad drew his arm back and proceeded to the front door, opening it wide. He instructed her to wait in her car while they figured things out. She began screaming about being his mother, but Dad simply pointed to the door. Grandmother went out, appearing smaller than I'd ever seen her, and we all gathered around the living room window to watch. She sat in her beat-up automobile, which was nothing like the luxury vehicle she used to drive with Uncle and Clara. Mom began pacing around the kitchen, running her hands through her hair repeatedly. She kept halting at the counter and then starting to walk again, as if she wasn't sure what to do. Dad followed her with his eyes, reminding her of how her grandmother had called her lazy and worthless when I was born. Mom's hands clenched, but she kept pacing, and I could tell she was warring with herself. Dad claimed grandmother preferred money over us, and only returned when the money was gone. Mom came to a halt and glanced at the ground, breathing heavily. I finally spoke up from where I was standing near the steps. I told them that our after-school program had 45 families that trusted us. What would happen if word got out that we let Dad's mother go homeless? Mom came to a halt and glanced at me, astonished. She admits to thinking the same thing about our reputation. Dad grabbed his phone and suggested they call Uncle first to see if he had changed his mind. Uncle answered the second call, and his voice was as frigid as ice when Dad narrated the issue. Uncle stated that his marriage with Clara had never been better since grandmother left. He was not going to sacrifice his wife's happiness for someone who simply cared about money. Dad turned it on speaker, and we heard Clara's voice in the background, wondering who it was. She took the phone and sprung a major surprise on us. Clara offered to pay for a motel stay for a few nights, but only through someone else. She would have no direct contact with her grandmother at all. She suggested that we hire a social worker to handle things, so there would be no family conflict. Dad thanked her and hung up, then walked outside to see grandmother still sitting in her car. We observed from the window as he leaned down to speak through her window. She began screaming loudly enough that we could hear it inside, but Dad interrupted her with sharp hand movements. He told her she couldn't remain here, but they'd work something out for tonight. Grandmother's face turned hot and she yelled something about desertion. Dad yelled back that she abandoned us first, literally as I was being born. He turned and walked back inside, leaving her sitting there, mouth open. Mom opened her laptop and began searching for a cheap motel in the vicinity. She discovered one approximately 10 minutes away that had good reviews and was reasonably priced. Dad called and booked a 3-night stay with Mom's credit card. He issued strong orders that no hotel charges should be added to the bill. The desk clerk looked perplexed, but consented to record it in their system. Dad went back outside and delivered the room key card to grandmother via the window. She accepted it without saying thank you, and drove away, mumbling something we couldn't hear. That night was tough for all of us. I kept tossing and turning, reflecting on all that had transpired. Around midnight, I heard Mom and Dad conversing quietly in their room down the hall. Mom kept telling us that we couldn't become like grandmothers by putting money and fame above family. Dad's voice was difficult to hear, but he sounded furious and exhausted. Mom explained that even toxic families were still family, and we needed to strike a balance. Their voices continued for at least an hour before quieting down. When I came down for breakfast the next morning, Mom had already been up making calls. She had the phone book open for government services and was taking notes on a yellow pad. After 3 transfers, she was connected to someone from County Social Services. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Marissa McCarthy and explained that she specialized in elder care resources. Mom addressed our position without delving into all of the unpleasant details. Marissa sounded understanding, saying that these family circumstances were more prevalent than people realized. She agreed to meet with us that afternoon to talk about housing help alternatives. Mom thanked her and hung up, clearly relieved to get some professional aid. Dad came down looking exhausted, with black circles under his eyes. He poured coffee and sat at the table, staring at nothing, while Mom told him about the social worker meeting. I took some cereal and noticed my parents appearing older than they had ever looked before. Around lunchtime, our neighbor sent Mom a text, causing her phone to ring on the counter. Mom snatched it up and her face paled as she read it. She gave Dad the message concerning grandmother's beat-up automobile that had been parked on our block since sunrise, with someone sleeping inside. Mom's hand began to shake, and she had to put the phone down before dropping it. Dad took his keys and walked to the door without saying anything. I observed from the window as he strolled down the street toward the aging vehicle parked 3 homes away. He banged on the glass, and grandmother sat up, puzzled and unkempt. They talked for a minute before Dad began swinging his arms about, agitated. He returned inside and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the portraits on the wall. Grandmother had not utilized any of the 3 motel nights we had purchased for, because she preferred to store them for when things went really terrible. Dad started pacing around the kitchen, claiming that this was exactly the type of manipulation she used. Mom told him that he could not force her to use the room if she did not want to. We still had to meet with Marissa that afternoon, so Mom cooked sandwiches that nobody ate. The drive to the county office felt longer than usual since everyone remained quiet. Marissa's office had posters on senior care and a large desk filled in documents. She explained that senior residences has waiting lists ranging from 6 months to a year long. The emergency shelters were overcrowded with persons suffering from mental illnesses, making it dangerous for older ladies. She took out a brochure for a rooming house on Maple Street that had an opening right now. The property required $800 for the deposit and first month, but it was tidy and had a manager on site. Dad's face turned scarlet as he heard the price, and he began to complain. Mom kept gazing at the photos of the modest rooms with shared bathrooms and a communal kitchen. Marissa stated that this was one of the best options accessible to someone in the grandmother's predicament. We thanked her and went with the pamphlet and a few benefit forms. That evening, Mom and Dad had their greatest dispute in years over what to do next. Dad insisted his mother made her decisions when she chose money over family 15 years ago. Mom was concerned about setting a bad example by allowing their family to become homeless. Their voices became more louder, till I couldn't take it anymore. Maybe Uncle would pay half if we asked him the right way, I whispered from the doorway. My parents both paused and glanced at me, as if they had forgotten I was at home. Dad contacted Uncle straight away, and put him on speaker so that we could all hear. Uncle listened to the entire event, and then went silent for a long period. He ultimately agreed to pay half, but only if the money went directly to the rooming house. Clara called and explained that Granny had to agree to remain away, except in extreme cases. She wanted everything in writing through Marissa to avoid any confusion later. Uncle explained that grandmother had already burnt out their goodwill, and this was the exact last thing they'd do. Marissa spent 2 days quietly working on the paperwork for the rooming home arrangement. Then, around 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, my phone began to fill up with texts from program participants. Grandmother had arrived during pickup time and was making a big deal in the parking lot. Mom and Dad rushed over, but I stayed at home, trying not to panic about what was occurring. When they arrived, Grandmother was telling a group of parents about how her own family refused to help her. Several parents appeared to be uneasy, and one mother approached Mom to inquire about her well-being. Dad had to forcibly lead Grandmother out from the crowd, as everyone watched and muttered. Some of the students were staring, and I knew it would be all over the school tomorrow. That night, the phone rang 3 times, with parents inquiring about the situation at pickup. 2 families mentioned they were considering withdrawing their children if there was family strife influencing the curriculum. Mom spent an hour on each conversation, attempting to explain without disclosing too many personal details. The 3rd family was more sympathetic, but they still had reservations about the program's environmental impact. Dad looked discouraged as he listened to Mom's attempt to restore their reputation over the phone. The next morning, Mom was cooking coffee when the phone rang again before 7 a.m. Colin from the local paper presented himself and explained that he had heard of an incident at the after-school program. He asked if we wanted to make a statement about the incident with the elderly woman in the parking lot. Mom's face turned white, and she began stammering about needing to call him back later. Dad took the phone and almost began telling Colin everything about his grandmother's previous actions and why she deserved this. I went in between them and seized the phone before Dad said anything we'd regret. Our family is working through some challenges while maintaining healthy boundaries, I said with humor. He appeared pleased with it and even highlighted his own mother-in-law, who caused similar troubles for his family. Mom relaxed slightly when Colin mentioned that he realized how complicated and personal family matters can be. He thanked us for the statement and said he'd make a brief remark without going into depth. After he hung up, we all gathered in the kitchen, tired despite the fact that the day had only just begun. Marissa called an hour later, saying she had organized a meeting with everyone, including grandmother, for the afternoon. The purpose of the conference was to establish all of the rooming house's boundaries and expectations for the future. We arrived in the conference room at 2 o'clock and waited in uncomfortable silence. Grandmother arrived around 3:15, stating she got lost finding the building. Dad pointed out that she had lived in this town for 40 years, and the county building had not moved. Grandmother simply shrugged and sat down, without apologizing for wasting everyone's time waiting for her. Marissa took out a folder and began spreading papers across the table, as grandmother stared with narrowed eyes. The papers had numbers and lists, which caused grandmother to lean forward, despite her attempts to appear uninterested. Dad drummed his fingers on the table while Marissa sorted everything into neat piles. Mom sat with her hands folded, watching the grandmother's expression shift as she realized this was not going to be easy. Marissa cleared her throat and began discussing her alternatives, but her grandmother kept interrupting with comments about how difficult life had been. She raised Dad and Uncle alone after their father departed, which caused Dad's cheeks flush hot. He slammed his hand on the table, startling everyone, and reminded her how much her parents had helped her. Grandmother tried to disagree, but Dad insisted that she prioritized money over family, not the other way around. His voice grew louder as he recounted all the times she had chosen fortune over relationships. Marissa raised her hand to quiet things down before returning to explaining the many housing alternatives available. She showed Granny photos of a rooming house with an openness, shared bathrooms, and a communal kitchen. The property required 3 months' payment up ahead, which would provide Granny time to file for welfare and possibly find work. When Marissa discussed working, her grandmother's face twisted, and she began to yell about being too old for jobs. Marissa simply pointed to the second choice, a homeless shelter with bunk beds and no privacy at all. Grandmother went silent quickly after seeing those shelter photographs of people sleeping on cots lined up in rows. When Marissa's phone rang, she answered and put it on speaker without first asking anyone. Clara spoke clearly, stating that she had been listening to Marissa's updates all along. She offered to pay for the rooming house, but only if grandmother agreed to one additional non-negotiable condition. Grandmother had to attend weekly budgeting seminars at the senior center beginning immediately, with no exceptions. Grandmother's face turned from pale to blazing red as she realized Clara was in control of everything from behind the scenes. She opened her mouth to refuse, but then looked at the shelter photos again before closing it without saying anything. Marissa drew up the agreement right there, including all of the terms, as we all saw grandmother sign it with shaky hands. 3 days later, we traveled to the rooming house with the grandmother's belongings packed in rubbish bags and 2 old suitcases. The building appeared decent from the outside, but the inside smelled like cabbage and cleaning products mixed together. Grandmother moaned the entire way up the stairs about her hip and how loose the railing was. Her room was modest, with a single bed against one wall and an old dresser. She began complaining about the common bathroom down the hall and how the window faced a brick wall. Mom kept biting her lip, trying not to say anything, while Dad kept bringing suitcases up. He reminded his mother that Clara had given her a king-size bed, which she had chosen to leave behind. After a minute of silence, grandmother began grumbling about the tiny mattress and rough sheets. We left her there unpacking and ranting about ungrateful children, while other residents observed from their entrances. The first week passed without touch, which seemed strange but also kind of calm for everyone. Then Dad's phone started ringing at work, and grandmother called during his shifts to complain about everything. She complained about the food, the noise, the other residents, and the temperature of her room. After the 6th call in 2 days, his boss called him aside and warned him not to make personal calls during work hours. Dad arrived home stressed and snapping at everyone, which was not typical of him prior to this incident. With all of the turmoil, I started having difficulties focusing at school, and my grades dropped for the first time in my life. My counselor, Daniel Price, spotted me spacing out in class and invited me to remain after one day. He sat opposite from me and inquired about what was going on without pressing too hard for details. I told him about the family issue, and he helped me understand that adult problems were not my responsibility to solve. He taught me various stress reduction tactics, such as keeping a notebook and going for walks when things were overwhelming. He reminded me that I could not control what grown-ups did, but I could control how I reacted to it. Meanwhile, grandmother was making trouble at the rooming house by grabbing extra food from the shared kitchen at night. Other tenants began complaining when their labeled groceries were missing, and tensions rose quickly. The manager called Marissa and informed her that grandmother had been caught red-handed with someone else's yogurt and sandwich in her room. Marissa had to drive over and mediate, as grandmother swore she had purchased those items herself, despite the fact that they bore someone else's name. The management warned that one more violation would result in eviction, and grandmother would have to find another place to live. Officer Hayes arrived at our door on tenant night, 2 weeks after we moved in his patrol cruiser with Granny. She'd been discovered trying to sleep on a park bench after being tossed out of her rooming house for 3 days. Grandmother admitted, amid sobs, that another resident had accused her of stealing money from their room throughout the night. The rooming house had a zero-tolerance policy for stealing, so they'd forced her leave while they looked into what had happened. Officer Hayes stated he couldn't keep taking her to the park, so we needed to work something out quickly. Dad contacted Marissa even though it was late, and she began making calls to find out what had happened. The investigation revealed that grandmother had not taken any money, but had been repeating sorrowful stories to other residents about her wealthy family abandoning her. She was attempting to solicit pity money from those who barely had anything, which resulted in the bogus accusation. The resident who accused her felt awful, but also upset about being duped into nearly giving grandmother $20. The rooming house decided to allow her back, but they warned her not to manipulate other residents for money or food. Marissa had to explain to her grandmother that this was her final chance, and any further problems meant she'd be out permanently. Mom couldn't sleep that night, so we decided we needed to help without enabling grandmother's conduct or overstepping our limits. She devised a plan to drop off goods once a week, subject to certain rules. Grandmother had to agree not to make any comments about our family or ask for anything other than what we brought. Mom wrote the guidelines and had Marissa deliver them so there would be no face-to-face confrontations. On the first delivery day, Mom packed basic goods such as bread and peanut butter and drove to the rooming home alone. She did not enter the room and instead left the bags with her grandmother's name on them at the front desk. Grandmother came down and accepted the luggage without saying anything, possibly the first time she had ever remained silent. Colin from the local paper contacted the following week to inquire about writing a feature on elder care and family boundaries. He had heard about our situation through the community grapevine and wanted to interview us on dealing with problematic family relationships. Mom and Dad agreed to talk, but only if he kept our identities anonymous in the story. Colin sat at our kitchen table for 3 hours, taking notes while Mom explained how we were trying to help without encouraging bad conduct. The piece was published on Sunday under the title, When Love Means Setting Limits, and it utilized instances that anyone who knew us would recognize right away. My phone exploded with texts from students who realized it was about us. Instead of the judgment we expected, numerous parents from the after-school program contacted us with their own tales and resources. One mother dropped off a folder with senior services material she had gathered while dealing with her own mother-in-law. Another family volunteered to connect us with an elder law specialist. The response was overwhelming in the best way. That following week, Uncle contacted Dad around 2 a.m., crying so hard he could scarcely speak. He acknowledged to discreetly sending grandmother money when she called, stating she was starving. Clara had discovered the bank withdrawals and chastised him for breaking their agreement. Uncle stated that grandmother had called him sobbing because the rooming house food was making her sick, and she hadn't eaten in 3 days. He had driven over with $200 cash without informing Clara. When Clara found out what had happened, she packed her bags and went to live with her sister. Uncle was devastated and urged Dad to speak to her. Dad drove to Clara's sister's place the next morning and discovered her sitting on the porch with red eyes. She was not upset about the money, but about the lying and going behind her back despite everything they had agreed on. It took Uncle showing up with flowers and a written commitment to never hide financial decisions again before she would consider returning home. They spent the next month in couples counseling, working with the trust difficulties that grandmother had caused between them. Meanwhile, Marissa had been working to enroll grandmother in the senior center food program. The center provided cooked lunches 5 days a week and maintained a food pantry on weekends. Grandmother qualified based on her salary and could eat for free. The first day, she arrived 40 minutes late, claiming she got lost, despite the fact that the center was 3 blocks from her rooming house. She sat at a table with 3 other women and quickly began telling them about how her wealthy sons abandoned her. One woman confronted her, claiming she'd heard Granny had family send off groceries every week. Grandmother adjusted her statement to claim that the groceries were primarily expired food that they did not desire. However, over the course of several weeks, she began to form friendships with a group that played cards after lunch. Marissa claimed that her grandmother showed up on a frequent basis, and even helped put up chairs on occasion. A month into my new schedule, I was doing homework when Dad's phone phoned with a number he did not know. The hospital called to report that grandmother had fallen at the rooming house and was treated for a damaged wrist and bruised ribs. The second resident stated that she had been reaching for something on a high shelf and lost her balance. Dad sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, staring at his phone, before choosing what to do. He phoned Mom at the after-school program, and they agreed to visit, but with tight rules. They were only going to stay for 30 minutes, so I had to come in as a buffer. We discovered grandmother in a hospital bed, appearing smaller than I had ever seen her, with her wrist bound and an IV in her arm. She burst into tears the moment she saw us, telling us how afraid she had been and how none of the nurses would listen to her. Mom inquired with the nurses, who informed her that grandmother had requested a private room and refused the authorized pain medication in favor of something stronger. Dad firmly told her that we were there to make sure she was okay, but that we would not be taking her home with us. Grandmother tried to argue she couldn't return to the rooming house due to her injuries, but the doctor walked in and said she'd be okay with some physical treatment. Marissa worked with Medicare to have the therapy reimbursed, and she arranged for medical transportation to take grandmother to her sessions. The doctor also recommended a walker, which caused grandmother's face flush scarlet. She maintained she didn't need it, and that it would make her appear old. Dad actually chuckled at her, not mockingly, but genuinely amused that she was concerned about appearances despite living in a rooming house. The walker proved to be required because grandmother's balance was poorer than she realized. 3 families who had threatened to leave our after-school program following the scene made by grandmother decided to stay after hearing how we were addressing the situation. One mother took Mom aside and told her how her mother-in-law had lived with them for 2 years, nearly destroying her marriage. She stated witnessing us establish boundaries while also meeting grandmother's basic needs gave her hope that families might survive such situations. The program grew stronger as parents helped each other through tough family dynamics. Marissa enrolled grandmother in mandatory budgeting seminars at the senior center as part of her aid obligations. The grandmother moaned during the first session, but the instructor contacted later to say she had actually engaged and even helped another attendee figure out percentages. By the 3rd week, grandmother was arriving early and making friends with a man who was learning how to manage his Social Security benefits. 2 months into the arrangement, Officer Hayes knocked on our door, embarrassed. He had caught Granny digging through our garbage cans at 5 a.m., hunting for bottles to recycle. She informed him that we had thrown away precious recyclables and that she needed the money for medicine. Dad's face became white, as Officer Hayes stated that he needed to issue an official warning for trespassing. We walked outside to find grandmother seated in the patrol car, holding a garbage bag full of cans. Dad understood she was truly dealing with poverty for the first time after years of recklessly wasting other people's money. Officer Hayes recommended that if we wanted to help without encouraging trespassing, we placed our recycling directly in the rooming house bins. As the 3-month rooming house payment deadline approached, we scheduled a family gathering in a neutral place. Uncle and Clara arrived together, their first appearance since the money incident. We met in a downtown coffee shop where grandmother couldn't accidentally show up. Clara astonished everyone when she offered to continue paying for the rooming house if grandmother met certain requirements. She had to continue attending budgeting classes, stop defrauding other residents of money, and agree to monthly check-ins with Marissa. Uncle emphasized that any transgression will result in the immediate cessation of support. Dad suggested that we put everything in writing this time to prevent future misunderstandings. Something happened that neither of us expected. Grandmother's knees buckled, and she slumped on our doorstep, wailing more than I'd ever seen anyone cry. Not artificial tears as previously, but true body-shaking sobs that made her entire figure shake. She grasped the porch railing and hauled herself up to look at Dad, her face flushed and blotchy. "I'm scared," she exclaimed between gasps. "I've never had to worry about money before, and I don't know what to do." Dad's expression shifted somewhat, and his jaw unclenched slightly. Mom placed her hand on his arm, and they engaged in one of those silent chats that married couples have. Finally, Mom walked inside and returned with Marissa's business card. She handed it to grandmother, explaining that Marissa might assist her in applying for senior housing and other perks. Grandmother accepted the card with trembling hands and murmured, "Thank you," which was perhaps the first sincere thank you she'd expressed in years. Over the next 2 weeks, Marissa and grandmother worked together to complete applications for every senior living community in the county. The waiting lists were all 4 to 6 months lengthy, but the rooming house manager agreed to keep her on a month-to-month basis as long as the payments continued and she ceased causing problems for the other residents. Meanwhile at school, Daniel noticed I was difficult to concentrate and invited me to stay after class. He helped me get started on my college application essays, one of which was about how to set boundaries with toxic family members. He reviewed my first draft and informed me that my ability to manage such a difficult issue at my age demonstrated true maturity. I worked on that essay for weeks, writing about how my parents created something out of nothing, while my grandmother prioritized money over family. Daniel helped me modify it into something that reflected growth without seeming bitter. Around the same time, Granny began visiting the senior center more frequently. The organizer there required assistance in the thrift shop 2 days per week, simply sorting contributions and pricing stuff. It only paid a little stipend but gave grandmother something to do other than moan. She still muttered that the labor was beneath her, but she arrived on time and completed the task. One afternoon, when I was assisting Mom at the after-school program, 5 new families arrived to register their children. One of the mothers approached Mom and said she had heard about how we handled the situation with my grandmother, maintaining boundaries while ensuring her basic needs were satisfied. She stated it motivated her to handle her own problematic mother-in-law in a healthier manner. Mom's eyes welled up and she had to take a brief break to use the restroom. After that, the program continued to grow, and we had to hire another part-time aide to keep up with all of the additional youngsters. Uncle contacted Dad more frequently, and they began meeting for coffee every week at the downtown cafe. They established a rule that they couldn't discuss grandmother during these sessions, only catch up on work and life. Dad returned home after these meetings looking lighter, as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. Uncle informed Dad that he and Clara had begun visiting a couples therapist to address the harm grandmother's deception had caused in their marriage. Clara had forgiven him for giving grandmother money behind her back, but they both wanted to make sure they communicated more effectively moving forward. The therapist assisted them in establishing new financial and family standards. 4 months passed with grandmother residing at the rooming home, going to her thrift shop work, and participating in senior center events. Then Marissa called to say that grandmother had been approved for a subsidized senior apartment. The rent would be based on her little Social Security payment, and she could move in the next week. Despite everything, we all came to assist her relocate. Dad rented a tiny truck. Uncle brought boxes, and Clara came to assist pack. Grandmother didn't thank anyone explicitly, but she also didn't complain. She merely quietly packed her few possessions and led us to load them into the truck. The senior housing building was rather lovely, with a community area and weekly programs. As we hauled boxes up to her second-floor home, I observed several occupants staring through their entrances. One woman about the grandmother's age introduced herself and explained that she too had a complex relationship with her children. Within a week, grandmother and this woman were playing cards in the communal room every afternoon, grumbling about their respective families. Dad stated that it was probably therapeutic for everyone concerned. A few weeks after grandmother moved in, the senior center coordinator called Marissa to offer her an opportunity. They required someone to assist with their lunch program, which entailed setting up tables and serving food 3 days each week. It was a legitimate paid position, not just a stipend, albeit still part-time. Grandmother reluctantly accepted the position, pretending as if she were doing them a favor. But Marissa later informed us she was one of their most dependable employees. She arrived early, remained late to assist with cleaning, and even began remembering the regular participants' names and dietary preferences. Marissa stated that in her 20 years of social work, this was some of the best improvement she has seen in a similar case. 6 months passed with Granny sticking to her regimen at the senior residence. She awoke at 7 a.m. every day to walk to the senior center for breakfast duties. She offered eggs and toast to the other residents 3 times a week. The organizer paid her every 2 weeks, and she spent the money on groceries and bus travel. She never apologized for calling me a disgrace when I was born. She never apologized for putting money before family, but she also stopped showing up at our home unexpectedly. She stopped contacting Dad's work phone during his shift. She stopped telling strangers sad stories about her ungrateful kids. Once the drama had subsided, Mom and Dad jumped back into the after-school program. They spent their weekends preparing the expansion they had been dreaming about for years. Colin remembered our tale and helped them apply for a community development award. They took 3 weeks to finish the application, which included all of the requisite papers and references. The award of $40,000 was approved 2 months later. They discovered an ideal spot on the north side of town, where no programs existed. Dad worked every weekend that summer refurbishing the facility with volunteer assistance. Mom interviewed and hired 2 more employees to assist with the increased enrollment. By September, 75 students had shown up at all 3 venues. Parents began describing it as the nicest thing that had ever happened to their area. The local news broadcast a piece in which children learned to change oil and solve algebra problems simultaneously. During my senior year, I concentrated on college applications, while everything else steadied. My grades were strong enough that several colleges expressed interest. The guidance counselor assisted me in applying for all available scholarships. In March, State University sent me an acceptance letter with a partial scholarship paying half of my tuition. Mom cried when she read it, and Dad grabbed me up and whirled me around the kitchen. 2 days later, a card addressed to me arrived without a return address. Inside there was a $5 bill and a note in wobbly handwriting expressing her pride. Dad laughed when he saw it, saying it was probably the first money she'd given someone in years. Mom carefully placed the card in my memory box. Anyway, Uncle called the following week with news that caused everyone to stop what they were doing. Clara was pregnant and due in the fall. They'd been trying for 2 years and were almost giving up hope. During the call, Uncle made it plain that grandmother's visits would be supervised only. No babysitting, no alone time with the infant, and no popping up unexpectedly. When they told grandmother at the senior center, she simply nodded without objecting. She realized she had little leverage to demand anything more. My graduation day came sooner than anyone imagined. The event took place in the high school football stadium on a beautiful June morning. Mom insisted on inviting the grandma, even though Dad believed it was unnecessary. She arrived 30 minutes early and secured a seat in the back row. She wore the same dress to every family occasion for the previous 6 months. When they announced my name, I noticed her sitting calmly. She did not cheer or wave like the other grandparents. She just watched, and then went without trying to attend our celebration supper. Mom later said that it was perhaps the best ending we could have hoped for. 2 weeks after graduation, the after-school program received a Community Excellence Award. The mayor presented the trophy during the ceremony, which took place at City Hall. Dad had to give a speech on their travels and the program's significance to the town. He thanked everyone who has helped them through difficult times without specifying any names. I sat in the 3rd row, watching him scan the audience. His gaze rested on grandmother, who was sitting in the rear in her customary location. Something shifted in his expression, and for the first time, I saw tranquility. He continued his speech by discussing how family may take numerous forms. The audience gave him a 3-minute standing ovation. Grandmother snuck out during the ovation, but not before I saw her wipe her eyes. She continued to live in her senior apartment while receiving benefits and working part-time. She attended holiday dinners when invited, but usually left before dessert. She visited Uncle's house once a month to see the baby, with Clara supervising every moment. She never held the infant without another person's hands nearby. She never complained about the constraints or attempted to push them. She wasn't the caring grandmother that children fantasize about. She wasn't even really pleasant most of the time. However, she was not the same destructive storm she had been previously. August arrived, and I began packing for college. My room looked weird, with half of my belongings in boxes and bags. That evening, we decided to swim in the pool one final time before I went. The water was wonderful, and the sunset turned everything golden. Dad floated on his back and stated that his mother was doing well at the senior center. Mom and I simply nodded, knowing that this untidy solution was the best we could get. Well, that's going to wrap it up for me today. It makes you stop and think about things, doesn't it? I appreciate you hanging out with me and walking through it all.